morning, y'all. It has been a minute. I'll be honest, it has. I've been traveling and clearing land and getting ready for the exhibit. So we've been busy, but I want to go through chapter 7 today because that's where we left off. I also want to give a disclaimer. We have 4 weeks until the exhibit. We may not finish this book by the time the exhibit gets here. I'm gonna just be honest with myself. At first I was like, I can produce 2 videos a day, X, Y, and Z, but I believe in a life of ease and not forcing myself to perform in ways that are more aligned with capitalism than what's good for my nervous system. So I will do my best, and my best will be different every day and every week, so take that with a grain of salt. But we're gonna keep reading. Chapter 7 was fantastic. If you've already read it, let me give you a little bit of the details. So in chapter 7 is the last part of part 2 before we get into part 3, the heist revisited. Chapter 7 is called Rising Up, and they talk about, she starts by examining how collectivist models start to be less appealing as Black people gain more capital. She talked about Black Wall Street, and we have this very particular vision of what Black Wall Street looks like, and she talks about that vision, that we think it's all about wealth or concentrated Black wealth, but it's more than that. She describes Black Wall Streets like Wilmington, North Carolina, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, which people are more familiar with Tulsa for sure. She describes them as places where Black people felt safe, heard, and cared for each day. So it's about more than just making money. It's about the type of community we can create and protect because of the wealth that we've accumulated. And so that's really interesting. So for example, in Wilmington, she said that there were Black-owned restaurants, there were Black jewelers, barbers, mechanics, coroners, carpenters, and tailors. She says at every level of society, there were Black people in charge and Black people owning things, which this whole thing has been about the importance of ownership. And the truth is, without land ownership, there can't be a Black Wall Street, right? If we don't own the ground that we're walking on, then it's not Black and it's not our own. So there's a clear connection between land ownership and the opportunity to create Black Wall Streets. She talks about these thriving communities, one called Bop City, where there's a lot of grown folks activity happening, how Black people were enjoying their life and being fruitful. And of course, the KKK had to come through and try to intimidate, but the Black community started patrolling. The KKK showed up and marched through the main street and did rides into the town. And the Black community in the area said no, so they armed themselves and protected their community, and KKK never returned. So it's even the importance of being able to protect what you own, right? My husband always says, you don't own it if you can't protect it. So protection is an important part of this as well. Now, what I was less familiar about until reading this book was the history of Oklahoma and why it became what they called a promised land for Black Americans. And so she talks about, and I want to start reading there. We're going to talk about Tulsa. And some of you have probably heard about Tulsa, the Tulsa Massacre, all of that stuff. But I always hear about the Tulsa Massacre. I hear less about how did it get started? Why did Tulsa become this promised land that Black people flocked to? So she starts by saying, across the country, this is on page 93, across the country in Indian Territory, Black people in Greenwood, a predominantly Black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, were also carving out their slice of heaven on earth. Both Black and Indigenous people attempted to make Oklahoma a refuge for their communities through widespread land ownership and entrepreneurship. Again, we can't have Black Wall Streets, we can't have thriving Black communities, we can't have safe Black and Indigenous communities without land ownership. Their efforts had been thwarted when the federal government broke treaty after treaty and organized a land rush in the region for white settlers. That didn't stop Black leaders from quite literally preaching the gospel of Oklahoma as a potential promised land for Black Americans. D.B. Garrett first traveled to Oklahoma from Kansas seeking something, anything, better than the violence and systemic exclusion he'd witnessed growing up. Alongside more than 300 others dubbed the Immigrant Society of Topeka, Garrett trekked southward until he reached the area where the colored colony was given permission and homesteads to settle. According to a May 1889 edition of American Citizen, 46,920 acres were owned by colored people from Topeka. This was just one of the many budding colonies across the state. An American Citizen article from June of that same year stated that the majority of those who have taken claim in Oklahoma Territory expressed themselves as well pleased with the promised land. So there's this idea that Oklahoma can be the promised land for Black people and Indigenous people. They do it through land ownership and entrepreneurship, and they're experiencing the fulfillment of it. So as more people come, they're reporting, they see it. They see that this can be the promised land, which is really cool. Again, I love this time period where you see so much Black progress, because before and during Jim Crow, because it shows for me, it shows how Black people have always created for ourselves and have always constructed communities, and made culture happen and accumulated wealth. We just don't always hear that history, and then simultaneously there's always been some effort to destroy what we create. And so the history book reads as if there's been a lot of oppression, enslavement, and white power. But it's important to read the other side of the history, right? It's important that even if something happened to thwart it or to end it or to destroy and harm us, we were still creating things, and we still are today. We still create, we still accumulate, we still cultivate. And that's such an important story to tell, because we never hear that side. We'll always think that we're docile, that we don't have power, that we can't get together and work together and make things happen, and we can. And then it started with land ownership, and now it may not be literal owning acreage, but owning something that you can claim as your own in this current world that we live in, I think is really, really important. And then what you do after that, so sharing it, and supporting other people. Sorry, the bugs out here. Oh, Lord have mercy. And supporting each other with it, which is the next part of the story. So it said soon advertisements were popping up across the South and Midwest, encouraging Black people to leave behind their troubles in favor of this oasis. One such appeal, a letter titled "To the Colored Men of the South," boasted that there was never a more favorable time than now for you to secure good homes in a land where you will be free and your rights respected. Give yourselves and children new chances in a new land where you will not be molested and where you will be able to think and vote as you please. This promise of Oklahoma is complete, right? The people are selling it. There are advertisements for it. This is an opportunity for freedom, true freedom. You will not be attacked. You will experience your rights fulfilled. All of this is being promised in Oklahoma. Going down a little bit further on page 94, it says the wealth of Tulsa's oil industry showed no signs of slowing down, and neither did the Black enterprises of Greenwood. It is believed that a dollar spent there circulated 30 times among other Black businesses. In that way, money was rarely hoarded, and everyone could enjoy the affluence that Greenwood had to offer. More than 30 city blocks became home to doctors' offices, beauty shops, pool halls, strong schools, and a large theater. As the community swelled, Booker T. Washington took notice, dubbing this area in Tulsa the Black Wall Street. So I did not know that Booker T. Washington actually labeled it as the Black Wall Street, which is really interesting, because if you know anything about Booker T. Washington, you know he was really big on Black wealth accumulation and economic accumulation as opposed to political power. So he thought, hey, get in where you can fit in this economy. We're no longer enslaved, but we might still have to work like we're enslaved in terms of a lot of physical labor. We shouldn't prioritize necessarily knowledge work or classical education. We prioritize an industrial education. And so it's interesting that he's coming in to label something as Black Wall Street, because that's his whole thing, which I've always had some conflict around Booker T. Washington. I'm more on the Du Bois side than Booker T, if I'm being honest, but I see the value in wealth accumulation as well as political power that Du Bois was talking about. So he talks about O.W. Gurley, a Black man from Alabama who had amassed wealth in Arkansas but knew the South would always impose a ceiling to his success, so he moved to Oklahoma in 1890s. And he was really responsible for accumulating a lot of wealth and organizing the society quite a bit. So it said Gurley's handprints seemed to be on every part of the city, whether he had directly supported the business or not. Due to his father-like role in the community, Gurley was appointed a deputy of the local police force. He was called to help establish an AME church, in the city center and boasted an investment portfolio of over 100 properties, as well as a net worth of $1 million. So Gurley individually is funding and supporting a lot of what's going on in this town, in Tulsa, and helping to uphold it. Now, the key to success for communities like Wilmington and Greenwood was the strength in numbers. Consolidation of wealth often had little to do with classism and everything to do with safety only found in groups. I highlighted this sentence. I think it's a really important sentence. She says, a black person in the late 19th or early 20th century was only as powerful as their neighbors. We've been talking a lot about community, and it's going to stay relevant because, again, I don't think we can return to land now without returning to community. Otherwise, anyone, no matter how rich or famous, could be isolated and picked off. Even someone as prosperous and beloved as Gurley. Money alone wasn't enough to save a black person, and actually, being the only one with money was more a hazard than an accolade. So in this capitalist structure, we're usually used to the few having a lot and then the many suffering under that system of capitalism. But in black communities like Greenwood, it's actually more of a threat or a hazard to only have a few people be wealthy. They needed to spread the wealth because they needed numbers and they needed more people to be doing well so that they had more protection at the end of the day. So community is actually what allows them to be successful and to maintain a thriving community at this time. And that's really important. She quotes Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He documented this history in the 1619 Project, which I referenced in my video a few videos ago, where I talked about books this book is in conversation with. And he says, given the large black population in these areas, freedmen made significant gains overnight, electing black state officials and aspiring economic changes and labor organizing on sugar plantations. Right, this is one of my favorite parts of it, because through collective action, they're able to change labor laws and make sure that the labor contracts that they're working under are more fair. So he says, white planters frequently complained that when they dismissed one worker, the others would immediately quit and threaten to leave the place. As new wage earners, black sugar workers, acting in solidarity, negotiated the best terms they could, signed labor contracts for up to a year, and moved from one place to another in search of a life whose daily rhythms beat differently than before. At one point, more than 10,000 black sugarcane farmers in Louisiana embarked on a strike, demanding a better share of the wealth they were making possible. After all, Louisiana was responsible for more than 95% of all sugar exports in America. Surely, the planters who employed these black workers could afford to pay them at least $1 a day, which would have been more than double their salaries. I want to go back just a little bit to give a little bit context. So she says, dissimilar to Wilmington and Greenwood, so she moves to talking about Louisiana first of all. And she says that working class Louisianans were more likely to be sharecroppers. So she's talking about the different industries that black people were able to work in at the time. Now in Greenwood, there's a lot, right? At almost every level of society, you see black people thriving and owning things. But she goes back to Louisiana and says that working class folks are more likely to be sharecroppers. And in that context, though, they're still able to gain some power. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the sugar workers being able to strike and push the needle forward. So this is the last page of the chapter, page 96. She says, W.H. Hamp Keyes, a community leader and former legislator, was instrumental in sustaining the strike for as long as it lasted. In their most notable action in 1874, Keyes had a march from plantation to plantation, ensuring that white growers who refused to bargain with them saw the might of their collective. For his work as an orator and organizer, Keyes was called the reputed leader of the mob and an instrument of great evil in the articles of the Times of Pequeño. The strike was off to a strong start and lasted approximately 3 weeks before police were called in by wealthy white planters to quell the nonviolent acts of the strikers. Not only that, white civilians were also authorized to take up guns and end the strike once and for all. We've seen that before. And squash it they did. In parishes across the state, black strikers were intimidated and killed. Thibodeau saw the worst of the violence, which can only be described as a massacre. Limp black bodies were dropped in unmarked graves. Reverend T. Jefferson Rhodes, a Baptist minister from the area, recalled later that there were several companies of white men, and they went around night and day shooting colored men who took part in the strike. Even those not involved in the strike became prey for the bloodthirsty vigilantes. Notoriously, a white Louisiana widow named Mary Pugh commented post-massacre that this will settle the question of who is to rule, the nigger or the white man. The message was clear. White wealth would not be threatened by black organizing. Whether explicitly political or not, any areas of concentrated black wealth, land holdings, and political power would be squashed in the years to come. Wilmington would be the first, a warning of the bloodshed to come. So that is the end of chapter 7. Unfortunately, a part of the history of this country is every time black people accumulate wealth, own land, do something for the collective that has nothing to do with white people, frankly, nothing to do with white wealth or white accumulation, there's always this violent response to remind us of our place. And thinking about that in the present time hits me a little heavy because I think about the recent lynchings. You know, there are reports that there have been 19 lynchings in 2026. So this year, there have been 19 lynchings. And contrary to popular belief, lynchings were not random acts of violence. They were ritual acts of mob violence. They were almost ceremonial. They were a way to remind black people of their place in this country. And so I think about that. I think about ICE agents, civilians, right? They're not trained. They haven't gone to some official police academy or anything. No, ICE agents are civilians being empowered empowered with guns and with shock gloves and all of these things to control brown people on this land in this country. So it's an old story. It's a very old story. It's an old playbook. Since the beginning of black resistance, there has always been white violence and white actions to maintain power and to maintain power and prevent the accumulation of black wealth and black opportunities. So there's always this violent response to black people, to people of color, trying to take what is ours, trying to claim our rights that the Constitution in theory gives us. But bringing it back to land ownership, you can't own what you can't protect. There was different forms of protection. Wealth is a form of protection. Political power is a form of protection. But owning guns and other physical means, fences, gates, all of these things are also forms of protection. And what I value most, though, as a form of protection is community. Being a collectivist, working together, sharing the wealth, sharing land, all of these things are a way of protecting us, because alone they can pick us off kind of easily. And she talks about in the chapter, I jumped around, but if you read deeply, it is easier to pick us off if we are alone, if we are isolated. So community is protection. Community is protection. I want us to reflect on the importance of black people owning what is ours, claiming what is ours, but protecting what is ours as well. How do we create the right protections? Is community our form of protection? Is gun ownership our form of protection? Is just wealth accumulation, capital our form of protection? Is political power our form of protection? I don't think just one of those is enough. I think we need an ecosystem of protection, because the ecosystem of white supremacy has done a really thorough job in making us not just feel unsafe, but be unsafe. And I said before, proximity to whiteness will not protect us. Only dismantling the system of white supremacy can protect us. But in the meantime, we should protect ourselves, absolutely. As we figure out how to dismantle, we should also work to protect ourselves through the means that we have available to us. I'm gonna be honest, I did not expect the conversation to go this way. I had some thoughts about what we would talk about today, but in quick summary, Black Wall Streets were not just about economic and wealth accumulation. They were spaces where black people owned the land, where they had power at all levels of society, and where there was collective thriving. It wasn't just that one person was doing well. It's that one often took responsibility for all, and there was shared wealth to make sure that everyone had opportunity to enjoy the affluence of communities like Greenwood and Wilmington and Tulsa. But of course, when black people were doing really well, there was always a white response. And it's not because there was an obvious threat to whiteness, right? So yes, in Louisiana, the planters are striking because they want wage equality and they want their rights as workers protected. But there's nothing that's really threatening white power in the literal sense, right? Black people aren't going into white communities and threatening them. But having a thriving black community is a threat to white supremacy for a few reasons. One, ideologically, it disproves the idea that black people are inferior, that we're docile, that we can't do anything without a white leader. And then two, if we don't have to rely on the government or on white organizations, then we can truly thrive on our own terms. And that has always been a threat to white people. They need us to be dependent. They need us to be disempowered, because then they have more control. They can control how we move, where we live, how we work, how we eat, how we form relationships and build communities. Everything is under white control. And I think ever since emancipation, white leaders, white capitalists in particular, white landowners, have been trying to regain and reestablish control over black communities. And they've done it in a number of ways. But one way is destroying and not giving us even an example or picture of what a thriving black community looks like. And so you hear ignorant comments now that are like, well, why don't black people just make their own? Why don't you just leave and form your own communities? Well, we have done that historically. We've done it a number of times across the country, stories known and unknown of that. And there's always a response to it. It's never cool. Black people are doing their own thing. We don't have to deal with it. There's always a violent response to it. And it continues to happen in large and small ways, on the individual level and on the collective level. Entire communities are trodden over and destroyed so that we can have things like Central Park and Wall Street and these other places that used to be, or Lake Lanier, that used to be thriving black communities. And it happens in the lynching of black people in Mississippi and Georgia and Virginia and Florida, that have been going on, because lynchings remind black people that we're not safe. It reminds us that we don't belong here, that maybe this isn't our home. And that's not true. We've worked really hard to be here, to create something of our own, and we have just as much a right as anyone to live and exist freely here. My final statement is that black land ownership sets the foundation for so much. But black strategies of protection are critical to maintaining what we're able to build once we have the land. Stay safe, y'all.